That's why startups end up failing, is they run out of money. If it sinks or swims, there's not a paycheck coming every 2 weeks. There is a very good value proposition to the hospitals from an economic standpoint.
Today, joining me is Nathan Friedman, founder and CEO of HemaSense. When we spend enough time in this industry working with physicians, monitoring patients, and seeing where diagnostics fall short, you start to recognize the technologies that move the field forward. HemaSense caught my attention, and I think you'll see why as we get into this discussion.
Right now, the method of detection is visual inspection. We can see it before you would ever see it at the skin level. We know how to do that. Let's go do it for ourselves instead of doing that for somebody else. One of the first questions I plugged in there was, what is the difference between private equity and venture capital and angel investors? Because I was like, what is this? We'll use any technology that's the right solution. We want to solve the right problem.
What are some of the key takeaways that you think would be valuable that you did not have, but that you could share with others?
Are you solving a real problem that somebody cares about? Identifying the problem, the clinical need, making sure that you really understand like what it would take to move the needle there is so important.
Nathan, welcome to Rounds.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Good to have you here. You know, during our pre-interview, we had a nice discussion, and there seems to be a lot of parallels in our past experience that have brought us where we are today. So before we jump into this, I want to first speak about Nathan Friedman, and if you can introduce to those watching, tell us a bit about Nathan Friedman, and then obviously that naturally rolls into the founding of HemaSense. If you could share that with us.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I am a mechanical materials engineer by training. Graduated Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute over 20 years ago now. And, from that time onward, I've always kind of just been a tinkerer, inventor, did a lot of that stuff in some of the studio classes in college, but then went right to W.L. Gore and Associates after I got out of college. And actually did an internship at Gore as well while I was in college. They recruited pretty heavily at RPI. While I was at Gore, I was primarily in the medical device division out here in Flagstaff for most of the time I was there, the 20 years. And during that time, I like to say I kind of started in transfer to manufacturing and then swam upstream a bit in the development process. And so I spent a lot of my time doing some transfer to manufacturing, but also really early prototyping, ideation, market needs assessment, things like that. And really that's where my passion is. I love, finding a big problem to go and solve and then coming up with ways to solve that. And I do that, I would say, both in my professional life, and I'm also a tinkerer and, problem solver in my personal life. I have a workshop at home, which is, where we do a lot of our work. And I've always kind of been interested in whatever the newest thing is out there, and I'll go play with it. So along the way, while I was at Gore, I started to get involved in some of the external collaborations that Gore was doing, not just from a clinical standpoint, but academic collaborations with schools like Stanford and MIT, where they have industry collaborations, as well as some M&A evaluation, kind of diligence efforts along the way. And really spent probably 10 years there in a group that was doing blue sky development for the medical division. So we were looking at everything that was adjacent to our portfolio, which was cardiovascular devices, but also things like neurostimulation and, soft tissue repair and lymphedema and all kinds of other things, just because we wanted to know if there was any application there we could get into. So kind of fast forward to the last couple of years I was at Gore, I was involved in a effort to build a device or component supply business that serviced other medical device manufacturers. And it was cool because we were kind of a startup within the big organization. And I had this opportunity to partner with another guy who was there that I had worked with before. And we were basically given the reins of this new business. And I was kind of the technical lead and he was the business lead. And we built this business, from nothing into, I think it was over $1 million in sales in about 2 years. and built our own systems and all this kind of stuff. It was truly like a startup experience within this big company. And unfortunately, that experience was a really good one, but it ended up getting shelved, and they decided to pull out of that business. And so I used that as an opportunity to say, you know what, I'm going to go outside of Gore and go try something else and try my entrepreneurial spirit, with a different medical device business.
Well, I find that fascinating. Before we jump off that, I mean, this is the part of the discussion that is so intriguing, right? It's about where you took your technical and business acumen and you turned it into something where you are now looking outside of the organization. And you're saying, I need to now be in the driver's seat, right? So how do you make that leap? Tell me about that leap, because that also can come with a lot of anxiety to try to make that switch in your career. Let's talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, it definitely does. And to be perfectly honest, I had no idea what I was going to do when I left Gore. I didn't walk out of there with an idea or with this, thought in my head of like, I'm going to go, start a company and, launch a business and all this kind of thing. But what I did is I stepped out of Gore and I said to myself, like, I want to just learn about this ecosystem of startups because I'm very much interested in it. And I actually had a couple friends who had left Gore a few years before me as well. And they kind of gave me some initial connections. And I started just kind of reaching out and understanding where I could play in that ecosystem. And, like many people do, I started with some consulting work and was trying to help out some other companies and, did some really good work for some other startups that were in various different spaces. But really where it sparked HemaSense and where I am now is I got together with these other two guys that had left Gore previously, and we ended up talking with a doctor who basically brought a problem to us and said, this is a problem I have. Can you guys come up with a solution? And I think at that juncture is really where we all have this history of being at Gore and knowing how to de-risk and how to move through the early phases of development to understand if there's a real opportunity there. And to be honest, it was just, okay, we know how to do that. Let's go do it for ourselves instead of doing that for somebody else. And we stepped through it. We're still consulting at the time and, getting our income from that stream, but all the while thinking, okay, let's figure out if this is a real business or not. And that mindset shift of, okay, I'm not really doing something all that different from kind of a process standpoint, but I'm doing it on my own terms. And the only person who is going to end up making the decision as to whether this is, a go or not is going to be us. And so we have to have a high level of conviction around this actually being something that's worth going after from an opportunity standpoint to make that leap into the business, because if it sinks or swims, there's not a paycheck coming every 2 weeks like you are at a big company.
Absolutely. And I love this story, right? Because every great product begins with identifying a gap, adding a solution, wrapping a solution around it. And now it's about, okay, let's go develop something that meets that need, right? So now you're in a development standpoint, and we spoke about money, capital. It's out there now. A few years ago when you were developing this, it was a bit more scarce.
Mm-hmm.
So where did you, dig in, and who was your first investor, and where are you now from an investment standpoint? If you could share, because that's interesting to me.
Yeah.
And I'm sure some of the viewers.
Yeah. It's a fundamental question and for any startup that you have to answer, because that's, I think the data is out there. That's why startups end up failing, is they run out of money, and they run out of money for a variety of reasons. But ultimately, that's what's going to stop you from being able to be solvent and moving forward. Before I answer your question directly, I'll say that there was actually a very deliberate series of tasks that I put on my own to-do list when I got out of Gore around funding and fundraising. And I kind of had this reflection time, which I think a lot of people do when they leave a large company, when you're saying, what do I want to do? But I also included in that question, where are my personal gaps? Where are the places where I don't have an experience or a knowledge base that I might need if I want to, play in this environment, in this world of startups? And the big one was funding. Funding for 20 years at Gore was you propose a project and it either gets funded or not, but you're still getting a paycheck. And so I actually spent a lot of time starting to understand, like, what are the motivations of investors? Why do people look at companies? What is valuable? What is not valuable? How do you structure companies to, be able to take in equity investment? How do you just fundamentally speak the language of a venture-backed startup? And
well, this has turned into like a master class on private equity, an understanding private equity and how to best speak to them, right? But go on. I did not want to stop.
No, and it's funny. So I went to MD&M. You probably know of MD&M, big trade show and everything. That was 3 days after I left Gore. That just timing wise, like that tells you it was in February. And I walked around that show and I met with a bunch of people and everything. And I remember going to an evening event, and I'll take this sidebar for a second. And I came back to my room that night, and I remember it was the early days of ChatGPT. And one of the first questions I plugged in there was, what is the difference between private equity and venture capital and angel investors? Because I was like, what is this? I don't even know what these terms mean. And that was, just a piece of that whole journey. So anyways, that's kind of just from a personal standpoint. I think the question you ask is a really valuable one for people to reflect on in themselves if they're getting into this world. So anyways, back to kind of our story. We went through all of the technology development for HemaSense self-funded. We said, we think we can solve this problem. We're going to take the time to scope out the business. But while we're doing that, we're going to go down the road of let's figure out which technologies are going to work, which are not going to work. And that was all before we even started a company. We didn't have an entity at that point. This was us, in our spare time, literally in our garage shops, like figuring out what might work and what might not. I remember it was August of, or July actually of 2024 when I actually took a trip out to California to visit a friend of mine, and we ran around and talked to a bunch of physicians that we had known, and I kind of validated the opportunity there. I said, is this really a problem? Is this really something we need to solve? And I came back from that trip and I said, you know what, this is a big problem. It needs a solution. I think we've got one. And we started the company the next week. We each put in, a little bit of money. We have 4 co-founders, including myself. We put in a little bit of money, mostly just to cover kind of the legal fees of getting the entity up and running and figuring out what that first round of funding was going to look like. And then our first few investors were actually, friends of mine, coworkers who said, I've worked with you long enough. What you're doing sounds like a good idea, and I know you well enough that I'll kick in, 25 grand a piece. And so we actually raised about 75,000 pretty quickly, and then didn't raise anything for like several more months. But that was enough to kind of keep us rolling and get through those first, few months of development before we started trickling in some more investors. So big picture, that was, like I said, back at beginning of this year, end of 2024, that we had those initial investors. And, I think we sat at about 125,000 invested for 6 months and couldn't find any more investors. And we just kept plugging away and hit some big milestones. And then eventually, when we hit a couple of those big inflection point milestones, like an animal study and things like that, we ended up closing out our pre-seed round at about just over 600,000, and we closed that about a month and a half ago. So we're closed with a pre-seed round. We also got a $250,000 grant from the state of Arizona, from the Arizona Commerce Authority. So that's been our funding so far, and we're using that to get through our animal studies, which are already done, and then some early human clinical work will probably fall under that funding round as well. And then we'll be raising another round this spring. That'll be a bigger priced round.
Well, Nathan, thank you for sharing. I think that is so insightful for anyone looking to raise capital, understand who a PE is versus a venture capital, right?
Yeah, I know the answer to that now.
And you're saving someone a trip to ChatGPT. So thank you.
Yeah.
So let's naturally jump to HemaSense, the product itself. I've had some time to take a look at it. I've come from the procedural world where I understand the post-op monitoring of patients, both from interventional cardiologists, but also from electrophysiologists. So let's talk about the product. Tell us about HemaSense.
Yeah. So I'd be remiss if I didn't, talk about the problem we're trying to solve first. So I'll give you the snapshot of that just so everybody's kind of up to speed, and then tell you about how we're solving that. So we have basically developed a wearable device that can detect subcutaneous bleeding. And this is an on-skin device. The application that we're going after first, where we see the biggest need and the biggest problem, is for femoral access catheter-based procedures. So this is anything that goes in the femoral artery or femoral vein in a catheter and is delivered, whether it's peripheral, neuro, structural heart, aortic, wherever that's going. And specifically, our initial target are the large diameter procedures. So this is any catheter that's above 3 millimeters or 9 French. And these procedures, the reason we're targeting them is because they have a quite high rate of access site bleeding complications. It's about 1 in 10 patients that has one of these complications. It's usually not life-threatening, but it is very expensive. It's very painful. It keeps them in the hospital for a couple extra days, and it's a pretty big burden to the healthcare system. And the reality is, when we dug into that, we found that there are ways of treating this that are very straightforward and very easy if you know about it early. Right now, the method of detection is visual inspection from a nurse doing their rounds. So what we do is we place a patch, which looks something like this, around the access site in the groin where your femoral artery is. And this patch has a series of electrodes on it, and it takes impedance measurements between each set of electrodes here. So we get 6 measurements, 4 around the outside and 2 across the center. And what this does is it starts to look at the conductivity of the tissue. And because blood is very conductive, when blood starts accumulating and infiltrating the muscle and the fat around that area, the subcutaneous space, we see the impedance go down. So the resistance of the tissue drops, or the conductivity goes up. We can see that very easily because blood is so conductive. So what we can do is we can take that data and use that to provide information to the nurses and to the physicians to say, hey, there is a very high likelihood that this person is experiencing a clinically relevant access site bleed, and we can see it before you would ever see it at the skin level. You should go treat them now, or you should go investigate further and decide what that treatment is, so that these patients are not staying in the hospital an extra 2 days, are not causing, a need for blood transfusions and secondary surgeries. They are able to treat that when it's small. They're able to confirm that they treated it and it is not bleeding anymore, and send those patients home on time, or in some cases even earlier than they would have.
Now, how is the monitoring done, and how is that alert made for the healthcare providers to identify that they need to address?
We have a companion tablet that goes along with our device. The device that I showed you is actually, this is an R&D version of it. So you can see the tether that comes off of it. This plugs into a unit to do the data monitoring right now. This tether goes away in the commercial version, which is under development. And there's a small electronics package that sits on this. The whole thing is disposable. So you pull this out of the package, apply it to the patient, basically pull a battery tab out, and it starts taking measurements. There's a tablet that we initially provide that has the interface to start a monitoring session, associate that with a patient. And that tablet has, various different mounting options where it can essentially sit next to the bedside. It can sit next to the stack of other monitors like blood pressure or SpO2 or something like that, and act as another monitor. But it also has additional functionality from a computation standpoint, but also from an information standpoint, so that you can kind of enter the interface beyond just the monitoring screen and see more details about the history and what's going on. And so that's part of our whole system. Those are the 2 components that we provide, is the tablet and the actual disposable patch that goes on there. So that's kind of how the system works. Yeah.
So what are the key differentiators in this product versus the typical standard approach, which is really, as you said earlier, more visual? But tell us about the early detection window, the usability of it, and some of the costs, or the cost savings, we should say, that go into the product.
Yeah. So like I said, current standard of care is visual and tactile, basically inspection, where the nurse is actually in some cases feeling and palpating the tissue. If it's somebody who has a lot of tissue and they need to, feel down into that, subcutaneous layer to go and detect that. As we all know, nurse work overload is a very real problem. There's a shortage of nurses. So there's a lot of tasks that they're responsible for. And so, no fault on anyone. It's kind of the system and how it's set up. These are often not detected until a large amount of blood has been discharged into that subcutaneous space. And when I say large amount, some of these are a half a liter to a liter of blood that has been emptied out of this vessel before anything happened to that patient from a treatment standpoint. And so we are offloading some of that need for them to be very diligent about this kind of detection and these visual inspections so that they can concentrate on other tasks. But we also are providing continuous monitoring so that if they're coming around every 15 minutes or every 30 minutes or every hour, to see that patient and something happens in between those time intervals, we can alert them of that in real time. The other piece of this that is really valuable is really the ability for us to clear a patient. And so we can say, we've been monitoring them for 2 hours and we feel confident that there is no blood accumulation here. So this is not one of the things that you need to worry about moving forward. And so that allows us to do that. To the point of what is kind of the financial implication and the patient impact on this, I mentioned there's actually some good literature on this. When one of these bleeding complications occurs, it's an average of 2 extra days in the hospital. And the latest data that we have is that it's about $18,000 in direct cost to the hospital when these patients stay that long, because not only is it taking up a bed and those beds have a cost associated per day, but there is also a cost with these secondary procedures. They may get 2 units of blood and some of them are going to go and have a secondary surgery, or they're going to get another device implanted to close this up. And if we can eliminate that stay time and catch it before that additional procedure needs to happen, because they could just use direct pressure or something like that, then we can save a pretty big burden on the hospital. So it actually gives us a nice margin. If you look at that, you can do the math, 18,000, 1 in 10 patients. That's $1,800 a patient on average that you're spending on these bleeding complications.
The economic drivers make sense, right? So every great product needs to have some type of direct or indirect economic driver, cost savings to healthcare, in order to really gain that traction and get the commercial effort that you need. So it's absolutely there. And as we see more and more procedures, or more, they're less invasive, I should say, and the time frame of a patient in the post-op unit and getting discharged to go home is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. Do you potentially ever see a product like HemaSense be used for hospital at home type of discharge? Or are you just looking at this primarily stage 1 commercial effort, pre-FDA, hospital only use?
Yeah. So short answer is absolutely. This has, outpatient, ambulatory clinic kind of applications. And there are some aspects of the device that we are deliberately designing in a way that will enable that when that time comes for us. A prime example of that is we have a lot of options for how these patches wirelessly communicate with the tablet. We're using Bluetooth. There's no reason to have a proprietary RF, protocol or something like that, because now in the future, I can connect this to a smartphone if needed. Now, the transition that'll happen there is certainly not our phase 1. We are absolutely going after inpatient procedures, large bore, as phase 1. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is because it's the highest need. The second big one is because these are currently reimbursed utilizing a DRG code, which means that there is essentially, I'll call it an all-in payment that is given to the hospital for performing one of these procedures. And that includes aortic aneurysm, that includes aortic aneurysm repair. It includes heart valve repair and replacement. Those are all lump sums. And so eventually we would like to get a reimbursement code that is specific to using the HemaSense device. But initially, there is a very good value proposition to the hospitals from an economic standpoint to say, this is going to increase your profitability if we're successful, regardless of whether we have an additional reimbursement code that gets used for this. Down the road, when we move to these outpatient clinics and we move to these at-home, kind of monitoring applications, we will want that specific reimbursement code because the reimbursement environment's a little different for ambulatory clinics. So that's the roadmap.
You seem to have the appropriate roadmap, the evolution of this technology evolving from where it's going to start or where you're going to validate it to where it could potentially end up. And it's an incredible time for such a product, especially when you look at many procedures moving from hospital setting into ambulatory surgical centers. There needs to be more oversight, more view of the patient, because those ASCs who are now taking on more and more procedures are doing less and less on the post-op piece of it. So it seems like a really opportune time to come to market with such a product.
Yeah,
okay.
I agree. Absolutely. I mean, that's why we're here. And I think there's, I have this discussion often, but I think it's a relevant one, is that I think we live in a time right now where sensors, detection algorithms, data processing streams have gotten so robust and so easy to implement. They're everywhere, and sensors are cheap and they're small and they're low power. The pinch point is no longer, can we sense something? It is, are we sensing the right thing that adds value? You can go out there and get a sensor that will detect whatever you want to detect nowadays. Those algorithms exist. But the real question is which of those data streams and how you process it is going to add real value to the patient, the provider, and the payer at the end of the day. And so that implementation of those technologies is I think, the greatest opportunity, and where a lot of companies, I think, focus on the technology. We said we'll use any technology that's the right solution. We want to solve the right problem.
Beautiful. Seems like you have a white canvas in front of you to really take this product and develop it for a couple of different channels, right? Hospitals and outpatient setting. So as you begin to develop this and as you begin to look at the approval of it through the FDA and, run through many of the validations that you need to, are there any partnerships that you're potentially looking at that would say, hey, this aligns incredibly well to where HemaSense is? Have you identified any of those partnerships, and what do they look like?
Yeah, we have. And I will say, from a high level, one of the most valuable kind of categories of partnerships or types of partnerships that we have actively been seeking out and have found several good ones is really around that early clinical partnership, where, again, going back to this kind of fundamental tenet of ours of being focused on the customer and adding value to a customer, we want to make sure that we don't just have that feedback cycle once, but we are having that feedback cycle continuously through our development. And, quite frankly, clinical insights are often some of the hardest to figure out how to get those valuable ones. But we've been able to partner with a couple institutions, some local, some, as far as abroad. And, we have a great one in Spain that we use a lot. But it gives us that opportunity to not just be us sitting in a room and saying, well, we think this is how they would use it, or we think this is what would be valuable to them. We pick up the phone or we go drive down to the, place that we have these partnerships set up, and we ask the people who are going to be using it those questions. And so, to me, those are incredibly valuable. And I'll say what's been really great about that is they start as a couple conversations, maybe with an individual provider, but then they start to kind of grow into, okay, now we all of a sudden have access to their whole, clinical staff who's organizing clinical trials. Some of these hospital systems even have venture arms that you can then start talking to about saying, look, we're already getting involved and your physicians are excited about this. Let's talk about whether you would be interested in participating in our next round of funding or something like that. So those clinical partnerships, I think, are so key, and they are ones that can really make the difference between a product that was designed, kind of in a vacuum with what you think would be wanted in the clinic versus what is actually wanted and needed in the clinic.
Yep, it's those early adopters, as you've said. You need to identify, stick with them, and continually have a bi-directional level of discussion with them that says, okay, we need to throw something at you here, right? So we need to understand better how we can improve this. To have that in the development stage of this is, it's critical. It really is.
Yeah.
So you look well rested, but I'm going to ask, every CEO and founder, you have a host of different items that keep you up at night. Funding, development, validation. You haven't gotten to FDA yet, but that also will keep you up. So what keeps you up at night at the moment, professionally speaking?
Yeah. I've been an insomniac for most of my life. So there's an element of I'm just up a lot, which probably is well suited to being a CEO of a startup, because it gives me a couple more hours in the day to either think about this stuff or just get something done. But, I would say to answer your question directly, funding is always something that as a CEO, you are thinking about. I mean, we are in a place right now where we have a decent runway, but it is by no means, something that I can just rest on our laurels and say, oh, well, I don't have to worry about that. I mean, we are funded through, I think, our next milestone, but I want to have our next round of funding set up before we even, get through that milestone if possible, because at the end of the day, the alternative is you just pump the brakes, and we don't want to have to do that. And I think we're on a good trajectory there. So that certainly is something that I think about a lot. I think the other piece that just from a big picture, is always kind of in the back of our mind is really how are we going to prove this direct economic benefit to the hospitals? And it's a complicated question because it's not something that I can just throw more resources at, or I can, go and, deploy, some of our time towards finding the answer to it, because it's an answer that we won't be able to definitively get until we're in the clinic and we're seeing how quick we can actually detect these and how much of an impact that really has on the economics of the whole equation. So that I wouldn't say keeps me up at night every night, but it is something that is always lingering in the back of our mind. And the reality is, myself, our CTO, Ben Trapp, I've worked with him for 22 years. He was at Gore with me as well. So we have a great relationship of finishing each other's sentences and things like that. But we both are always kind of thinking about that and saying, okay, what are the little pieces of that we can chip away at to de-risk it? Things like getting into an early clinical trial and doing some early clinical work, even if it's 5 or 10 patients. Things like building out a robust economics model so that we really do understand the economics in the hospital of these bleeds. But I think that's the big one for us that will be a question until we can get in the clinic and start getting some of that data to support it.
Yeah, and unfortunately, all of these items that you make reference to are dynamic, and year over year they can shift, and they can either shift in your favor or against you. However, I think there's less of a risk in what you're developing that you would have a negative shift in where, say, CMS or value-based healthcare is heading, because I think you fit quite well into that, which will contribute to the success that you have. So as we come to, say, closing out a topic and a call, I always like to have any founder and CEO give their insight to anyone watching that is looking to develop something new or open up a company. What are some of the key takeaways that you think would be valuable that you did not have but that you could share with others?
Yeah,
Thought-provoking question.
it is. Yeah. And I think, some of them, a lot of the ones that you probably hear and probably the ones that I'm going to say, I'll preface it by saying they seem obvious, but they're also ones that are so critical for you to really spend some time digging into. The first one is absolutely what we've talked a lot about, this idea of, are you solving a real problem that somebody cares about? One of the things I didn't mention in kind of my background is I actually teach core classes through the National Science Foundation, which is, for those who don't know, it's a short, 4-week kind of, I'll say, entrepreneurship class, but it really focuses around this idea of connecting a real need to, a solution that you can provide. And it starts with the customer need. And I feel passionate about that approach enough that I take time out to go, jump in and teach one of those classes a few times a year, because I want people to understand that. So identifying the problem, the clinical need, making sure that you really understand like what it would take to move the needle there is so, so, so important. I think the other piece that I always, reinforce is build the right team that is not just willing to go the extra distance and like solve these problems, but is willing to question and pivot if you run into something, or if they feel like you're not, focusing on the right things. And it's a hard thing to put into practice, and it's an easy thing to say, but, surrounding yourself with those people who can, fill in your gaps in knowledge and skill set, but also who are willing to learn something new and just jump in when that need arises. That's, it's a cliche that, especially at these early stages, investors, they invest in teams, they invest in the team, not the product. But that's the reality, is you have to find those people who have that passion. And you also have to find those people who have the skill sets that round out what you're going to need to get to the next phase.
Valuable advice from Nathan Friedman, founder and CEO of HemaSense. Nathan, thank you for being on this week's episode, and look forward to seeing the development, approval, and commercial effort of your company.
Yeah. Thank you, Joseph. I appreciate it. And thanks for taking the time to chat with me today.